What if the one person you loved the most betrayed you in the worst way possible? A husband discovers his wife's shocking affair. He pretends to forgive, but secretly he has a plan. As the lies unravel, the tension rises, and revenge becomes inevitable. Will he find the strength to walk away, or will the truth break him? The consequences of betrayal are darker than you think. Are you ready to find out? Watch until the end. You won't believe how it ends. Rob sat quietly in his study, the hum of the late evening settling in around him. His eyes traced the flickering light of his computer screen, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been a long day, filled with meetings and endless reports, yet the weight of the night seemed heavier than any work task he had ever faced. He had always trusted Jessie, his wife, but something had shifted recently. A feeling, a subtle gnawing feeling, had started to creep into his thoughts. He glanced at his phone lying on the desk. It was a text message from Jessie. Her name flashed on the screen, a seemingly innocent message. "Let's talk tonight." His thumb hovered over the screen, the message making his stomach churn. It wasn't the message itself, it was the pattern of how Jessie had been acting recently that made Rob uneasy. The late nights, the sudden distance, the secretive phone calls. He'd sensed it before, but this felt different. Rob had never been the type to invade her privacy. He trusted Jessie with his heart and his life. But tonight was different. Tonight, that feeling grew so intense he couldn't ignore it anymore. His hands shook as he unlocked the phone, his heart racing. He hadn't planned to do this. He hadn't wanted to, but now there was no turning back. His finger tapped her messages, and it was then that his world started to crumble. The first message was from Alan Thompson, the man Jessie worked with. Rob had always thought of him as a professional acquaintance, nothing more. But what he found now made his blood run cold. "I miss you. We need to talk. The hotel tonight?" Rob's breath caught in his throat. His eyes scanned the message again. His mind fought against the reality of what it was telling him. But there it was, plain as day. Jessie, his wife, was having an affair with Alan, the man he had met countless times, the one who had always seemed so friendly, so harmless. Rob's chest tightened as he continued to scroll through the messages. The more he read, the more the weight of betrayal settled in his chest. There were plans for secret meetings, messages filled with longing, and words that had no place in a marriage. The evidence was undeniable. Jessie had been hiding her affair right under his nose. He felt sick to his stomach, his head spinning with disbelief. The love, the trust, it all felt like a distant memory now. His hand gripped the phone tightly, the edges digging into his skin. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath, but the anger, no, the hurt, was overwhelming. He wanted to confront her right then and there, demand the truth, but something inside him stopped him. He couldn't act rashly. He needed to think, to plan. If he was going to deal with this, he had to be smart about it. For a moment, Rob just sat there, staring at the phone, as the weight of the discovery settled around him. His world had changed in an instant, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But one thing was certain. He wasn't going to let her get away with this, not without facing the consequences of her actions, and he would make sure she knew the truth, but on his terms. Rob stood up, walking to the window, his mind racing. He could feel the emotions swirling inside him, anger, betrayal, heartbreak. But beneath it all, there was a calm, cold determination. He wasn't going to let Jessie's lies tear him apart. He had a plan now, and nothing would stop him from seeing it through. The days that followed Rob's discovery were filled with silence. The house, once a place of warmth and familiarity, felt cold and distant now. Jessie, unaware of the storm brewing inside her husband, went about her routine, trying to act as though nothing had changed. But Rob's mind was far from peaceful. Every moment spent in the same house with her felt like a betrayal, one he had yet to confront directly. Rob had made a choice. He wasn't going to confront her immediately. Not yet. Instead, he would play the part of the forgiving husband, the one who had no idea of her affair. He would allow her to believe everything was fine, to think that he had accepted her apology and was willing to move on. He would watch, wait, and let the truth unravel itself. He had a plan now, and this was just the beginning. For the first few days, he kept his distance. He remained calm, collected, even affectionate in a detached way. Jessie, relieved by his apparent forgiveness, tried harder to regain his trust. She sent him messages, called him more than usual, and even planned small surprises to prove that she was trying to make things right. But Rob could see through it all. It was too little, too late. Every time Jessie tried to touch him, to make him smile, Rob felt a wave of anger wash over him. He couldn't touch her without remembering the images of her with Alan, the whispered words, the stolen moments, the lies. But he hid it. He had to. For now, it was all a game, and Rob was the one in control. "Are you okay?" Jessie asked one morning as she placed a coffee cup in front of him at the kitchen table. Her eyes searched his face, hoping to find some sign of warmth, some indication that things were returning to normal. Rob looked up, meeting her gaze. He smiled gently, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice smooth, calm. "I just think we need some time, that's all." Jessie nodded eagerly, relief flooding her face. She sat down across from him, her hands clasped together in front of her. "I know I messed up, Rob. I didn't know what I was doing. Please believe me. I'm sorry." Rob's jaw tightened, but he didn't let his anger show. He had promised himself that he would remain composed, remain the husband she thought she knew. The smile never faltered as he responded, "I believe you, Jessie. I just need some time to process everything." His words were gentle, almost comforting, but inside, Rob was anything but calm. Every part of him wanted to scream at her, demand the truth, but he couldn't. Not yet. This was his moment of control. He needed to make her realize what she had done. He needed to make her feel the weight of her betrayal, to see the destruction she had caused in his heart. Jessie reached out and touched his hand, her eyes filled with hope. "I know we can fix this," she said softly. "I'll do anything. I just want us to be happy again." Rob's heart ached at her words, but he didn't let it show. He pulled his hand back slightly, just enough to create a small distance. "We'll see," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The days that followed were a blur of similar conversations. Jessie's attempts to reconnect were constant, but Rob's facade remained unbroken. He pretended to forgive, pretended that he could move past her infidelity. But inside, the wound festered. Every time she tried to touch him, every time she looked at him with those hopeful eyes, it made him feel something new, disgust. But Rob was patient. He had to be. His plan was already in motion, and with every passing day, Jessie unknowingly dug herself deeper into the hole she had created. She thought she was fixing things, but Rob was watching closely. He would wait until the perfect moment to reveal everything, to show her the consequences of her betrayal. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Rob thought about the future. He could already picture how this would unfold. It would be his turn to make the decisions. Jessie would regret her actions. He would make sure of it, and when the time came, she would have no choice but to face the truth. Rob had always believed that Alan was nothing more than a colleague to Jessie, a professional partner in their world of marketing and business. But the conversation he overheard at the coffee shop a week ago had shattered that illusion. The way Jessie had looked at Alan, the intimacy in their exchange, had made Rob feel like an outsider in his own marriage. The fact that Jessie had kept the affair hidden from him only added to the wound. But what happened next made Rob's blood boil. It was an ordinary Thursday, and Rob was finishing up a meeting when he received a text from Jessie. She was late coming home, working late again. Rob had learned to accept this as part of their routine in recent weeks. But something in his gut told him this wasn't just another late night at the office. He glanced at his phone one more time as he stood up to grab his coat. The text from Jessie wasn't just an apology for being late. It was a message from Alan sent directly to her phone. "Is he there yet? I'll wait for you at the usual place. Just us tonight. No distractions." Rob's grip tightened around his phone, his hand shaking. The words burned into his mind, each letter a cruel reminder of the betrayal. He stared at the screen for a long moment, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just an affair. This was a complete breach of trust, an act that left him no room for doubt. Alan, the man he had thought was just a professional acquaintance, was now playing the role of a lover. Rob didn't confront Jessie immediately. Instead, he decided to wait, just like Alan had done. He needed to see how far this had gone. His plan had always been to act calm, to play the part of the forgiving husband, but Rob was no longer sure that forgiveness was even possible. He wasn't sure if he could ever look at her the same way again. That night he followed Jesse's usual path. He made sure she was unaware of his presence, staying just out of sight. She met Alan at a small, dimly lit bar, a place they had frequented before, back when their relationship was just beginning. Rob watched from a distance as Jesse embraced Alan. The scene played out like a sickening repeat of what Rob had seen in his mind since he first discovered the truth. But now it was real. The sting of reality was even worse than his imagination had prepared him for. For a moment, Rob felt a surge of anger, the urge to march over and confront them both, but he stayed rooted to the spot. This was the moment of clarity he had been waiting for. Alan was no longer just a shadow in the background of his life. He was an active participant in the destruction of everything Rob had worked for. This had gone beyond infidelity. It was a deliberate act of manipulation and deceit. As Rob watched them talk and laugh, he could see how comfortable they were together. The closeness, the chemistry, it was all so evident. Alan had no fear of being caught. Jessie, on the other hand, seemed genuinely happy, her laughter light and free. That image, Jessie, the woman he had once trusted above all else, so carefree and unaware of his watchful eyes, stung worse than any words could have. Suddenly, Alan stood up and placed a hand on Jessie's shoulder, his voice low, intimate. Rob felt a tight knot form in his chest. This wasn't just an affair, it was an ongoing betrayal, a destruction of everything they had once shared. Jessie wasn't even pretending anymore. She wasn't even pretending to care about what she had left behind. Alan's eyes caught Rob's for a split second as he turned to leave, but Rob stayed hidden in the shadows, his face impassive. Alan didn't know that he had been watched. He didn't know that Rob had been planning his next move for days now. As Jessie stood to leave, Rob watched her, his mind racing. The thoughts of revenge had taken root, and he knew it was time to make his move. Alan had made the first challenge. Now it was Rob's turn to show him that he wasn't as weak as Jessie had thought. Rob walked back to his car, his heart pounding. The cool night air felt oddly comforting against his skin. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. The game had changed, and Jessie had unknowingly given him the power he needed to finally take control. Emily had always been a perceptive child. At just 12 years old, she could read the room better than most adults. But the atmosphere in her house had shifted, and no amount of pretending could hide it. Her parents, once so full of laughter and warmth, now felt like strangers to each other. Rob and Jessie were distant, their interactions cold and minimal. Every night Emily felt the tension simmering beneath the surface, and it left her feeling restless, unable to sleep. She had noticed the subtle changes before, the late nights Jessie started having, the secretive phone calls she'd make, always stepping out of the room to talk in private. Rob, on the other hand, was quieter than usual, often lost in thought. He didn't smile as much anymore. When he did speak, his words were flat, as though he were going through the motions of family life without actually being part of it. One evening, as she sat at the dinner table, Emily noticed the way Rob and Jessie exchanged brief, tense glances. They barely spoke to each other, and the silence was suffocating. Emily couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, something big. After dinner, Emily found herself alone with her mother in the living room. Jessie sat on the couch, fiddling with her phone, while Emily stared at her, trying to make sense of everything. "Mom, what's going on?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessie looked up, her eyes tired. "What do you mean, honey?" Emily hesitated, but the questions had been building inside her for days. "You and Dad, you don't talk like you used to. You don't look at each other like you used to." Jessie's face stiffened for a moment before she forced a smile, trying to mask the discomfort. "Your father's just been stressed with work, sweetheart. You know how it is. Sometimes things get a little difficult." Emily wasn't convinced. She had seen how her mother had been acting lately, how she'd become almost too eager to please Rob, but he remained cold, distant. The warmth that had once been there between them was gone. "But you don't look happy," Emily pressed, her voice trembling slightly. Jessie's smile faltered, and for a split second Emily saw something more vulnerable in her mother's eyes, a fleeting glimpse of guilt, of regret, that quickly disappeared behind a veil of reassurance. "I'm happy, sweetheart. Everything's fine. Your dad and I are just going through a rough patch, but we'll work through it, I promise." But Emily wasn't sure she believed her. Something in her gut told her it wasn't just a rough patch, it was something deeper. The change in her parents was too dramatic, too sudden. Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She tossed and turned, the silence of the house pressing in on her. It was then that she heard voices, faint but clear, coming from the kitchen. She crept quietly down the hallway, curiosity getting the better of her. She peeked around the corner, hoping not to be noticed. Rob and Jessie were standing near the kitchen counter, speaking in low tones. Jessie's words were barely audible, but Emily caught a few phrases that made her blood run cold. "I can't do this anymore, Rob. I can't keep pretending." Rob's response was softer, but his voice was tight. "You're not just hurting me, Jessie. You're hurting her too." Emily's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what they were talking about, but it was clear now that whatever was happening between them wasn't just affecting their marriage, it was affecting their whole family. For a brief moment, Jessie's voice wavered. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said, her tone breaking. "But it has, and now, I don't know what to do." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what exactly had happened, but the guilt and pain in her mother's voice were undeniable. Rob's voice, calm but edged with emotion, broke through the silence. "You've already done enough damage. It's time to face the consequences." At that moment, Emily stepped back, retreating to her room, her mind racing. She had known something was wrong, but now she understood that it was worse than she had imagined. Jessie wasn't just unhappy, she had made a choice, and that choice had torn their family apart. As Emily lay back on her bed, her thoughts swirled. She didn't know what to do with this knowledge. Should she confront her mother? Should she tell Rob? The weight of the secret felt too heavy for someone her age, but she knew that she couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth, no matter how painful, was always more powerful than the lies people tried to hide behind. The days were beginning to blur together, each one passing in a haze of cold silence. Rob had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, at maintaining control, but now it was different. Every minute spent in the same house as Jessie felt like an eternity. The anger that had been building inside him ever since he discovered the truth now simmered under the surface, threatening to boil over. But Rob knew better than to lash out, at least not yet. His plan required precision, and he wasn't going to let his emotions derail it. Jessie seemed oblivious, or perhaps she was just playing her role, pretending that everything was fine. Her attempts at affection, at making things feel normal again, were like a sharp knife twisting in Rob's gut. She would smile at him, try to initiate small talk or plan dinner together, but he could see through it all. He wasn't fooled by her acts of contrition, and as much as he hated it, he couldn't bring himself to say anything to her, not yet. Rob had become a master of silence. He would sit across from her at the dinner table, eating his meal without a word, his mind elsewhere, as Jessie chattered on about her day, about work, about anything that wasn't about them. Every sentence that left her mouth felt like another lie, another thread in the web of deceit she had spun around him. It was maddening, but Rob stayed calm. He would play the part of the forgiving husband until the time was right. But it wasn't just Jessie that Rob had to watch. Alan was another matter entirely. Rob had begun to track Alan's every move. He knew the man's schedule by heart. Where he went for lunch, where he worked out, and, most importantly, when he and Jessie were meeting. It was clear that Alan didn't suspect a thing. The arrogance with which he operated, so sure of himself, made Rob sick. Alan thought he had the upper hand, that he could walk around freely with no consequence. But Rob was patient. Rob was calculating. Every evening, when Jessie would leave for another one of her business meetings with Alan, Rob would be waiting. He had become so adept at hiding his emotions, at wearing the mask of indifference, that Jessie had stopped asking questions. She thought everything was fine. She thought Rob had forgiven her. But Rob was planning. And while Jesse was out, Rob would spend hours researching, plotting his next move, the next step in his intricate web of revenge. He had been doing it for days now, methodically preparing for the moment when everything would be exposed. He wasn't just going to confront Jesse. No, this would be a lesson in trust, in betrayal, in consequences. And Alan? Alan would have his own reckoning. The house felt empty when Jesse wasn't home. Rob found himself walking the halls aimlessly, his thoughts consumed by the tangled mess of emotions inside him. He had never felt so disconnected from his own life. The love he had once felt for Jessie seemed like a distant memory, fading with every lie she told. But the anger, it was fresh, raw, and it burned inside him every time he thought about the affair, about the way Jessie had betrayed him. He'd gone through the motions of their marriage for months now, pretending that nothing was wrong. But inside, everything had changed. The warmth they once shared was gone, replaced by a coldness that Rob couldn't escape. The silence between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Rob had become a ghost in his own life, walking through the house, waiting for the right moment to strike. There were times when Rob would catch himself thinking about how this would all end. Would Jessie come to her senses? Would she feel the full weight of her actions when she realized that Rob was no longer the man she had married? Or would she continue to lie, to pretend that nothing had changed? The thought of her still trying to maintain the facade made him sick. And yet there was a part of him that missed her, a part of him that still longed for the days when they laughed together, when they trusted each other. But that part of him was buried deep, buried under layers of hurt and betrayal. Rob had long since learned to keep his emotions hidden from Jessie, but the war raging inside him, his silent war, was a battle he couldn't win alone. His mind flashed to Alan again, the man who had come into his life under the guise of a colleague, only to destroy everything. Rob could still see the smug look on Alan's face when they'd met for the last time. It was the look of a man who thought he had won, but Rob wasn't finished yet. He wasn't going to let Alan walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. Rob took a deep breath as he stood in the hallway, looking at the door through which Jessie would soon walk. He had to be ready. The moment of truth was approaching, and he would need all his strength to carry out his plan. The silence in the house felt like a warning. Everything was about to change, and Rob would make sure that when it did, Jessie and Alan would both understand the true meaning of betrayal. Rob's patience had been stretched to its limit. The act of pretending, of playing the part of the forgiving husband, had drained him. Every time Jessie smiled at him, tried to engage him in casual conversation, or touched him as though nothing had changed, it felt like a slap to his face. The longer he let it continue, the more it gnawed at him. But now, sitting in their living room, he could feel it. His breaking point was near. The house was quiet, as it always was when Jessie wasn't home. Rob was left alone with his thoughts, the memories of their life together swirling in his mind. He could remember a time when he and Jessie had been inseparable, when they would talk for hours about their dreams and their future. That life seemed so distant now. Now, everything felt like a lie, an illusion that was slowly falling apart. He looked at the clock. Jessie was supposed to be home any minute. The day had come, the day when everything would change. Rob had spent the last week preparing for this moment, getting his emotions under control, making sure he had all the evidence he needed. He was done pretending. Jessie's betrayal had gone on long enough. The door creaked open, and Rob's heart skipped a beat. Jessie stood there, her eyes bright, a smile on her face. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice light, casual. "How was your day?" Rob didn't respond immediately. He stood up from the couch, his gaze hardening as he looked at her. Jessie froze, the smile slipping from her face as she sensed the tension in the air. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping closer. Rob took a deep breath, the anger he had kept hidden for so long bubbling to the surface. "What's wrong?" he repeated, his voice cold. "You want to know what's wrong, Jessie? I'll tell you." Jessie's expression changed to one of confusion. "What are you talking about?" Rob walked towards her, his eyes burning with the weight of everything he had been holding inside. "I know about you and Alan," he said, his voice unwavering. "I know everything. The secret meetings, the messages, the lies. Jessie took a step back, her face paling. "Rob, please, I can explain." "No." Rob cut her off, his voice rising now. "There's nothing to explain. You've made your choice. You've made it very clear where your loyalties lie." Jessie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. Rob could see the guilt and fear on her face, but it didn't move him. Not anymore. "You've been sleeping with him, haven't you?" Rob's words cut through the silence like a knife. "All this time you've been lying to me, pretending everything was fine. But I know the truth. I've known for weeks." The tears in Jessie's eyes finally spilled over, but Rob didn't flinch. He had prepared himself for this moment. He had prepared himself for the emotional fallout. But he wasn't going to let her manipulate him any longer. She had already taken everything from him. His trust, his love, his sense of security. "I never meant for it to happen this way," Jessie said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Rob. I don't know what to say. I was confused, and Alan, he made me feel things that I thought I lost." Rob laughed bitterly, the sound empty and hollow. "Confused? Is that your excuse?" He stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You've ruined everything, Jessie, and now you want me to forgive you? To take you back like nothing ever happened?" Jessie shook her head, her sobs growing louder. "No, I don't expect that. I don't deserve that. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." The guilt in her voice should have affected him, but it didn't. Rob had given her everything, his heart, his trust, his future, and she had thrown it all away. She had betrayed him in the most intimate way, and now all that was left was the wreckage. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Jessie," Rob said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't even know if I want to." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Jessie stood there, her body shaking with sobs, while Rob fought to keep his own emotions in check. He had reached his breaking point, and now there was no going back. "I think it's time for us to face the reality of what we've become," Rob finally said. Whatever this is between us, it's over." Jessie collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, and for the first time in weeks, Rob felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, relief. It was a small, fleeting moment, but it was enough to remind him that he was in control now. He wasn't going to let her keep him trapped in a cycle of lies and betrayal. As Rob turned to walk away, he couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of the end. The calm before the storm. Rob had seen enough. The more he observed, the clearer it became that Alan had no idea who he was dealing with. Alan, the charming, self-assured businessman who thought he had everything under control, was making a critical mistake. He had underestimated Rob in ways that could cost him everything. The encounter had been simple enough. Rob had tracked Alan's movements for weeks, noting when he left his office, when he stopped by the gym, and, of course, when he met up with Jessie. Rob knew every detail, every routine. It was like clockwork, predictable, and therefore exploitable. One afternoon, as Alan walked out of a meeting at a cafe they both frequented, Rob decided to make his presence known. He was tired of lurking in the shadows, of watching his life unravel while Alan lived in the illusion of success. It was time to send a message, one that would strip Alan of his arrogance. Alan was standing outside on his phone when Rob approached. There was no hesitation in his step, no wavering. Alan looked up, caught off guard for a moment, but the smile that crept across his face was unmistakable. He thought he was in control. Rob could see it in his eyes. He thought nothing could touch him. "Rob," Alan greeted, his voice smooth. "What a surprise. How's everything going?" Rob didn't respond with pleasantries. His voice was calm, too calm. "How long did you think you could keep this up?" he asked, his eyes fixed on Alan, watching the color drain from his face. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't see you for what you really are?" Alan's smile faltered just for a second. It was enough for Rob to see that doubt creeping in. Alan's overconfidence was slipping. "What are you talking about?" Alan said, his tone still trying to sound casual, but it was clear he wasn't as confident as before. "I'm talking about you and Jessie," Rob said, his voice dropping lower. "You think you've been clever, that no one would ever figure it out, but I know. I know everything. Alan's eyes narrowed. For a moment he tried to brush it off, his hand motioning dismissively, but Rob saw the tension building. Alan's mask was cracking, and Rob was going to make sure it shattered completely. "You don't know anything," Alan said, but his voice was weaker now. He was trying to regain his control, but it was slipping. Rob took a step closer, his presence commanding, undeniable. "I know enough. I know how you've been seeing my wife. I know you've been playing this little game behind my back, and I know you thought you could get away with it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But you won't." Alan was silent for a moment, his face changing, finally registering the seriousness in Rob's words. The cocky grin that had been there before was gone. Alan, the man who had been so sure of himself, looked vulnerable for the first time. "What do you want, Rob?" Alan's voice was quieter now, less sure. It was a stark contrast to the bravado he had worn moments before. Rob stared at him coldly. "I want you to understand something," he said slowly, the words dripping with authority. "This little game you've been playing isn't over. I'm not going to sit back and let you walk away without consequences." Alan's lips pressed together in a tight line, and Rob saw the glimmer of fear in his eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. Alan wasn't used to being confronted like this, not with the weight of Rob's quiet determination pressing down on him. "You think you're untouchable, Alan," Rob continued, his voice a low threat. "But you're not, and the next time you lay a hand on my wife, I will make sure you regret it. You won't have any way out. You're in this as deep as she is." Alan took a step back, swallowing hard, his face flushed. Rob could feel the power shift. Alan had underestimated him from the start, thinking Rob would never find out, thinking he could slip by unnoticed. But now, Rob was the one in control, and Alan could see it. "I'm done with this," Rob said, turning on his heel. He didn't need to say more. Alan was left standing there, defeated, and Rob could hear the harsh breath of realization from behind him. Rob didn't look back as he walked away. He had made his point. Alan's overconfidence had been his undoing, and now the ball was in Rob's court. The game wasn't over yet. It had just begun. The weight of the secret had become too much for Emily to carry. For days, she had quietly watched the slow decay of her family, the distance between her parents growing with each passing moment. Rob was quieter, colder, and Jessie had become a ghost of the woman Emily used to admire. The lies, the awkward silences, the lack of any real connection between her parents, it all added up. Emily wasn't a child anymore. She could see the truth. Her mother had betrayed her father. The nights Jessie came home late, the whispered phone calls, the way her eyes would flicker nervously when Rob asked simple questions. It was all too obvious. Emily had tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that things would get better, but every time she looked at her parents, she felt more and more like an outsider in her own home. It had to be said. Emily knew that if she didn't confront her mother, it would only eat her up inside. She couldn't continue watching her family unravel without doing something. So, that evening, when Jessie came in from another long day at work, Emily decided it was time. "Mom," Emily said, her voice trembling but firm. Jessie glanced up, startled, her face breaking into a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Jessie asked, her voice soft but strained. "I need to ask you something," Emily said, stepping closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why are you lying to Dad? Why are you pretending everything's fine?" Jessie's expression faltered for a moment, the mask of calm slipping just enough for Emily to see the flicker of guilt. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a forced smile. "What do you mean, honey? Everything is fine. Your dad and I are just going through a tough time. It's nothing to worry about." Emily shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Don't lie to me, Mom. I see it. I hear the way you talk to him. I see how you avoid him. And I know you're seeing someone else. I know about Alan." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessie's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Emily stood her ground, her chest tight with emotion, watching her mother for any sign of remorse, but all she saw was fear. Jessie took a shaky breath, then finally spoke, her voice breaking. "Emily, I never meant for you to find out like this. It's just, I don't know what happened. I made mistakes, big ones. Big ones? Emily echoed, her voice rising. You've been lying to Dad for months. How could you do that to him? How could you do that to us? Her words cut through the air like a blade, her anger and hurt pouring out in a rush. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never wanted to hurt you or your father, Jessie said, her voice shaking as tears welled in her eyes. I was confused, Alan. He made me feel wanted again, but I never meant for things to get so out of hand. Emily's heart ached, but the pain only deepened the anger that had been building inside her. And what about Dad? What about his heart? His trust? You don't just destroy that and say sorry. It's not that easy. Jessie wiped at her eyes, trying to steady herself. I know. I've made a terrible mistake, but I'm going to fix it. I'm going to make things right. Emily stepped back, shaking her head. How? How are you going to fix it? You've already broken everything. You've broken him, and now you're breaking us. I can't just pretend like this is okay anymore. I don't know what to say, Emily, Jessie whispered, her voice small and broken. I never wanted any of this. I'm so sorry. Emily looked at her mother, her heart torn. She had always looked up to Jessie, admired her strength and beauty, but now she saw the cracks in the facade. Her mother wasn't the strong woman she thought she was. She was a woman who had fallen prey to her own desires, and in the process, she had lost everything that mattered. I don't want to hear sorry, Emily said, her voice firm, though it trembled. Sorry doesn't fix this. You've hurt Dad too much. I don't know how you can fix it, but I can't stand by and watch you tear our family apart anymore. Jessie opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Emily turned away, unable to look at her mother any longer. She couldn't stand seeing her like this, couldn't stand the weight of the lies. I don't know what's going to happen now, Emily said, her voice quieter but filled with sorrow. But I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I'm done with the lies. Jessie remained silent, her face a mask of regret and guilt. Emily didn't know if she could ever forgive her mother or if things would ever be the same again. She didn't know how much more of this she could take, but she knew one thing for sure. Everything had changed. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that made Rob's skin crawl. He could hear the distant sound of Jessie moving upstairs, probably getting ready for dinner, probably pretending everything was fine. But Rob knew better. He knew the truth now, the one truth that had changed everything. He had watched her for weeks, listened to her excuses, her justifications, and her hollow apologies. But the time for pretending was over. It was time to confront her, to put an end to this charade once and for all. He could no longer be the man who stood silently by, silently suffering. He wasn't that man anymore. As Jessie descended the stairs, Rob stood in the living room, his gaze unwavering. She paused, a look of surprise flickering across her face, but then she gave him that familiar, tentative smile, the one she had been wearing for the past few weeks, as if nothing had changed. Rob didn't return the smile. He was done pretending. Rob? She said softly, stepping into the room. What's going on? You've been so quiet today. I've been quiet for too long, Rob replied, his voice calm, but underneath it was an edge she couldn't ignore. He was done being the forgiving husband. Jessie frowned, her confusion deepening. What do you mean? Rob took a step forward, his expression hardening. I know everything, Jessie. I know about you and Alan. I know about the late nights, the secret meetings. I know you've been lying to me, pretending to be the wife I thought I had. Jessie froze, her face draining of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Rob's gaze never wavered. You don't get to do this to me, he continued, his voice quieter but full of force. You don't get to break everything we built and then expect me to just forgive you. I've been watching you and I've been watching him. I know how far this has gone. She stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. Rob, please, No! Rob's voice cut through her protest like a knife. I don't want to hear it anymore. You've made your choices, and now it's time to face them. Jessie's eyes welled with tears, but Rob didn't soften. He couldn't. He had given her chance after chance, and each time she had taken him for granted. You've hurt me, Jessie. You've shattered everything, and now you expect me to just take you back? To pretend like none of this happened? Rob's words came out sharper than he intended, but he couldn't stop them. "I never meant to hurt you, Rob. You have to believe me," Jessie whispered, her voice breaking. "I was confused. I didn't know what I was doing. Alan, he made me feel things I hadn't felt in so long." Rob clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. "You don't get to use that as an excuse. You don't get to destroy everything we had because you were confused. You betrayed me and you betrayed Emily. And for what? A temporary fix to your own brokenness?" Jessie collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. Rob stood over her, watching as the woman he had loved so much fell apart in front of him. But there was no sympathy in his heart, not anymore. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on them, and for a brief moment he almost felt sorry for her. But then he remembered the nights of pain, the sleepless hours wondering if she would come home, the crushing knowledge that everything he had built with her had been torn apart by someone else's hands. "No more lies, Jessie," Rob said, his voice calm again, but with an undeniable finality. "I'm done." Jessie looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret and fear. "Rob, please, I don't know how to fix this. I've made such a mess of everything, but I'll do whatever it takes. Please don't leave me." Rob's jaw clenched as he shook his head. "It's too late. You've already left me. And I can't keep pretending that I don't know what's been happening. I can't pretend like everything is fine when it's not. Not anymore." He turned away from her, his chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. Jessie's pleas followed him, but he didn't turn back. He couldn't. This was the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was the only thing left to do. For too long he had been stuck in the shadow of his own pain, hiding it behind a mask of indifference. But no more. The truth had been set free, and with it, so had Rob. The weight of the betrayal had crushed him, but now he was free to rebuild his life, one step at a time. He walked toward the door, each step heavy with the weight of his decision. Jessie's voice, broken, pleading, faded as he left the room, but it no longer mattered. The final confrontation had come, and Rob had won. The silence in the house was suffocating. After Rob walked out, leaving Jessie to face the aftermath of her betrayal, the weight of the truth pressed heavily on both of them. Jessie sat motionless in the living room, her face streaked with tears, her mind a whirlwind of regret. But there was no comfort coming for her. No one would come to hold her and tell her it would all be okay. Rob was gone, and now the consequences were crashing down. It felt like hours before she could muster the strength to stand. Jessie wiped her tear-streaked face with the back of her hand, the weight of the conversation still heavy in the pit of her stomach. Her world had crumbled. The affair, the lies, the deceit, everything had led to this moment. The husband she had once known and loved was now a stranger, and the family they had built was shattered. She reached for her phone, almost on instinct. Her fingers hovered over Alan's name, but she stopped herself. What good would it do to call him now? Alan had always been there when she needed him, or so she thought, but now his absence felt as loud as a scream. He had made her feel special, wanted, needed, but in the end he hadn't been the man she thought he was. And now he wasn't there when she needed him most. Jessie closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts, but all she could see was Rob's cold face, his words replaying in her mind. "I'm done." He had said it so calmly, but the impact of it shattered her. Rob had been the strong one, the one who had always held their lives together, and now she had nothing. Upstairs, Emily was still in her room, processing everything she had learned. The confrontation with her mother had been brutal, raw, and far more than Emily was ready for. She had never imagined her mother, this strong, beautiful woman, could fall so far so easily. Emily had always admired Jessie, but now she couldn't look at her the same way. The betrayal cut too deep. She didn't know how to fix things or if they could ever be fixed. She lay back in bed, her thoughts consumed by the arguments, the hurt, and the fact that everything had changed. Her parents were no longer a unit, no longer the team they once were. It was too late to undo the damage. Emily could feel the cracks between them, feel the tension thick in the air, and she knew that nothing could ever be the same. Meanwhile, Rob was still in the car, parked down the street, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He was angry, but more than that, he was relieved. It was finally over. The truth had been set free and there was no going back. The weight that had been pressing on his chest for months had lifted, but it was replaced by an emptiness he wasn't ready for. He had expected anger, or sadness, or even regret, but all he felt now was numb. He wanted to go home, but not to that house, not yet. Rob couldn't face it. The memories of Jessie and the life they had shared haunted him, and he wasn't sure if he could go back. How could he go back to a place that had been so poisoned by lies? Rob's phone buzzed. It was a message from Jessie. "Rob, please, let's talk. I'm sorry. Please don't leave me." He stared at the screen, the words stinging like salt in an open wound. He knew she was sorry. He knew she was regretting it, but the damage had been done. There was no turning back from this. He had tried to forgive, tried to move past it, but somewhere along the way, something inside him had snapped. He couldn't live with the lie anymore. Rob put his phone down and started the car. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay in that house, not tonight. Not when everything was falling apart. Meanwhile, back at home, Jessie's phone buzzed with another message. This time it was Alan. "We need to talk. Come to my place tonight." Jessie stared at the message, her hands trembling. Part of her wanted to run to him, to feel the comfort of his arms around her, the only place that had felt safe for so long. But the other part of her, deep down, knew that running to Alan wasn't the answer. It wasn't going to fix anything. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Emily. "Mom, I'm sorry," Emily said when Jessie answered. I don't know what to do." Jessie closed her eyes, the pain in Emily's voice hitting her harder than any slap ever could. "I don't know either, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." But the apology felt hollow. It wasn't enough. Nothing would be enough to make this right. Jessie sat on the edge of the bed, her phone clutched in her trembling hands. The house was still. The silence had grown unbearable, a constant reminder of the wreckage she had caused. Rob was gone. Emily, though still in the house, had retreated to her room, too hurt, too angry to even speak to her. The text from Rob had come earlier that day. "I'm done." Those 3 words had ripped through her like a physical blow, and now all she could do was wait, stuck in the limbo of her own choices. Jessie had never imagined that it would come to this. She had been so sure, so confident in her ability to fix things, to salvage her marriage. But now she was face to face with the consequences of her actions, and they were more than she could bear. Her mind raced, thinking of everything she could say to make it right, to undo the damage. But the more she thought, the more hopeless it seemed. She had no excuses left. She had failed. She had broken him. Rob had tried and tried again to forgive her, but she had pushed him away, pushed him into the arms of cold silence. She had let Alan in, let him convince her that there was something missing, something that Rob couldn't give her anymore. But now she was paying the price. The phone in her hands buzzed and Jessie's heart leapt. She looked at the screen, Alan. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Jessie?" Alan's voice was calm, as though everything were still normal, still the way it had been before everything fell apart. "I don't know what to do anymore," Jessie whispered, her voice breaking. "I've lost him. I've lost everything, Alan." There was a moment of silence on the other end. "You still want him, don't you?" Alan asked softly. There was no anger in his voice, only an almost detached curiosity. "Yes," Jessie breathed. "I want him back. I don't care how hard it is, I don't care what it takes, but I can't lose him." Alan's voice softened, but there was a sharpness hidden beneath it. "You know, it's not that simple, right? You can't just erase what's been done." Jessie closed her eyes, tears spilling down her face. I know that. But I was wrong, Alan. I was wrong to let this happen. I was wrong to let everything slip away." She took a deep breath, gathering what little courage she had left. "I need to fix this. I need to make it right with Rob, no matter what it takes." Alan was silent again, and when he spoke, his voice was more firm, more final. "Jessie, you can't fix it. You broke him, and now you have to live with the consequences." The words hit her like a slap. She had known this deep down. She had known it from the moment Rob had walked away. from the moment he had told her he was done. But hearing it from Alan, hearing it so clearly, made it undeniable. "I'm sorry, Alan," Jessie whispered, "but I can't be with you anymore. I don't love you, not like I love him." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched, and Jessie felt the weight of her words settle over her like a heavy blanket. She had made her choice, but now she had to live with it. "Goodbye, Alan," she said, her voice trembling as she hung up the phone. Jessie wiped her tears away, her heart heavy with regret. She had pushed Rob away for the last time. She had destroyed everything, and now she had nothing left. She stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her as she walked toward the door of Rob's study, the one place she had never dared to enter since he left. She knocked softly, almost as if she didn't want to disturb the silence that filled the house, but she had to try. She had to make one last attempt to fix what she had broken. Rob's voice came from inside, quiet but firm. "What is it?" Jessie swallowed hard, taking a deep breath before she spoke. "Rob, please, can we talk?" Rob sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at the floor. The house was silent. The stillness had become his constant companion, but today it felt different. Everything had led to this moment, the confrontation, the hurt, the silence. He had given Jessie every opportunity to come clean, to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But now, after everything that had happened, he knew the time had come to make a decision. He heard the soft knock on the door. It was Jessie. His heart tightened, but he didn't move. He couldn't move. "Rob?" Her voice was tentative, almost too soft, as if she were unsure whether he would let her in. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't know what to say. Could he find it in himself to forgive her? Could he ever look at her the same way again? Or had the damage been too much, the lies too deep to ever heal? "I know you're there," Jessie continued, her voice shaking. "Please, can we talk?" Rob closed his eyes, letting out a deep breath. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He couldn't keep living in limbo. He had to make a choice that would change everything. "Come in," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessie opened the door slowly, stepping inside. She looked like a woman who had been broken, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Rob could see the desperation in her posture, the way she held herself back as though afraid to get too close. But he couldn't feel sorry for her anymore, not after what she had done. She stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to say. Finally she spoke, her voice small. "Rob, I don't know where to start, I don't know what to say, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I'm so sorry for everything, for lying to you, for betraying your trust, for letting Alan come between us." Rob didn't look up. He couldn't. Every word she spoke felt like another knife twisting in his chest. He had heard it all before, the same apologies, the same promises to change, but none of it mattered anymore. The trust had been destroyed, and there was no going back. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Jessie," Rob said finally, his voice tight. "You've said it all before. You've apologized and promised to do better. But the damage is done. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And I can't keep living with this." Jessie's breath caught in her throat, and she took a step forward, her hands trembling. "Please, Rob, don't do this. Don't leave me. I can't live with myself knowing I've hurt you like this. I've made mistakes, and I'm so sorry. But I'm willing to do anything to fix this. Anything." Rob shook his head, a cold, hollow laugh escaping his lips. "You think saying you're sorry is enough? You think that after everything I've been through, that your apology is enough to fix this?" His voice was rising now, the anger bubbling to the surface. "It's not enough, Jessie. It's never going to be enough." Jessie flinched at the sharpness in his tone, but she didn't back away. "I don't expect forgiveness, not right away," she said, her voice steadying. "But I'm begging you, please don't give up on us. Don't give up on our family. I still love you, Rob. I need you. We need you." Rob felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest at her words. He had loved her once. He had given her everything, his heart, his trust. And now she was begging him for another chance. But could he ever trust her again? Could he ever forgive the woman who had broken him? The silence between them stretched on, the weight of it pressing in, suffocating him. Rob could feel the tears threatening to spill, but he refused to let them fall. He had to stay strong. He had to make the right decision. For himself, for Emily. "Jessie," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly, "I can't do this anymore. I can't live in the shadow of your lies. I've tried to make it work, but I can't keep pretending that things are okay when they're not. We've tried, and it's just not enough." Jessie's face crumpled, her hands reaching out to him, but Rob stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy and final. "I can't keep living like this." Tears streamed down Jessie's face, her body trembling with the weight of his rejection. "Rob, please," she begged, her voice barely audible. "Please don't leave me. I'll change. I'll do whatever it takes." But Rob stood there, his back to her, knowing that this was the only way. Knowing that the love they had once shared had faded, and no amount of apologies would bring it back. "I'm done," he whispered, the finality of it settling in. With those words, Rob turned and walked out of the room. Jessie collapsed to the floor, her sobs echoing in the silence. But Rob didn't look back. The decision had been made. Days had passed since Rob made his final decision. The house felt emptier now, each room a hollow reminder of what used to be. Jessie found herself alone in the silence that had once been filled with the noise of family, laughter, shared moments, warmth. Now there was nothing but cold, hard regret. She sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the empty space in front of her, as if hoping that if she stared long enough, Rob would walk back through the door, apologizing for his harsh words, telling her it was all a misunderstanding. But that didn't happen. Instead, the only thing she could hear was the echo of her own guilt. Jessie had spent the last few days replaying everything in her mind, the affair, the lies, the way she had pushed Rob away. She couldn't undo what she had done. No amount of apologies could take back the hurt she had caused. Rob's cold rejection still lingered in her heart. He was gone, and he wasn't coming back. She had destroyed the most important relationship in her life. Her phone buzzed, and for a fleeting moment, Jessie hoped it was Rob. But when she looked at the screen, it was just another message from Alan. She felt a wave of disgust rise in her chest as she stared at his name. "Still thinking about everything," the message read, followed by a simple, "Are you okay?" She scoffed, the words falling heavy on her heart. Alan hadn't even cared enough to stick around, to face the fallout of her actions. He had used her just as she had used him to escape the emptiness she felt inside. And now she was alone with the consequences of her choices. Jessie turned off the phone, feeling the weight of the silence once again. She tried to focus on the things she had once loved, the hobbies that had once brought her joy, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. The vibrant colors of her life had been replaced with a dull, lifeless gray. Her thoughts drifted back to Rob. She missed him. She missed the way he used to look at her with love and trust, the way they could spend hours talking, laughing, planning their future. But now, that future had been ripped away from her. It was all her fault. She had chosen to let Alan into her life, and in doing so, she had destroyed the life she had with Rob. "Why did I let this happen?" she whispered to herself, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Why couldn't I see what I had?" But it was too late for questions. The damage had been done, and no matter how much she wished she could turn back time, she couldn't. She couldn't undo the affair, the lies, or the hurt she had caused. Rob was gone, and the love they had once shared was now just a memory. The doorbell rang, and Jessie's heart skipped a beat. For a moment she dared to hope it was Rob, but when she opened the door, she found Emily standing there, her face pale and distant. The air between them was heavy, thick with the unspoken words neither of them could voice. "Can I come in?" Emily asked quietly, her voice almost breaking. Jessie nodded, stepping aside to let her daughter in. She closed the door behind her and watched as Emily walked into the living room, her eyes scanning the room before settling on her mother. Jessie could see the hurt in her daughter's eyes, the same hurt she saw in Rob's before he left. And for the first time in a long while, Jessie felt a deep ache in her chest. I don't know what to say, Mom, Emily said softly, her voice trembling. I don't know how we got here. Jessie's heart shattered. She wanted to take her daughter in her arms, to apologize for everything, to tell her that none of this was her fault. But the truth was, Jessie had failed her. She had failed Rob. She had failed herself. I'm so sorry, Emily, Jessie whispered, her voice barely audible. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you or your dad, but I did. Emily didn't speak right away. She just stood there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if trying to protect herself from the pain. The silence between them was deafening, and Jessie could feel the weight of the brokenness between them. I wish you could have stopped, Mom, Emily finally said, her voice thick with emotion. I wish you had seen how much Dad loved you, how much we loved you. Jessie's chest tightened as she fought back tears. She had known deep down that her daughter had always seen through the cracks in her facade. Emily had been the one to notice the little things, the late nights, the sudden distance between her and Rob, and now all that was left was the truth, a family torn apart by Jessie's own selfishness. I know, baby, Jessie whispered, her voice raw, and I'm sorry. I will carry this regret with me for the rest of my life. Emily didn't respond, but the sorrow in her eyes was enough. She didn't have to say anything. Jessie had broken her family, and now she had to live with the consequences. Jessie stood there, feeling the weight of her choices crushing her, knowing there was no way to undo what had been done. The regret was all-consuming. She had lost everything, and the life she once knew was nothing but a distant dream.